Please join me in giving Kyle Bauer a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
I did come home from college in 1980 to farm, and did until about 10 years ago when my knees got bad and I'd already ruptured one disc in my back, and none of my kids were interested in farming. And so I divested of our part of active agriculture at that point. But partly it was because we had bought the local station in 1994 and then KFRM in 1996. And I was a very active farmer, active in, I understand Farm Bureau has spoke with you. I was active with them. I was active with KLA. And the number one farm station out in this part of the state was a station out of Nebraska, KRVN in Lexington, Nebraska. And I thought, you know what, if Kansas farmers will listen to a Nebraska farm station, maybe they'll listen to a Kansas one. And that was how scientific the reason for doing that was. So I'm serious as can be. I knew nothing about running a radio station. We bought the local station in 1994 out of philanthropy. It was started in 1978, and it had never made money, and 1994 they were on the verge of collapse, and we had a number of other businesses in Clay Center, and so we bought it so the town could keep its station, and fiddled with it a bit for a year, ended up able to turn it around, and I got intrigued with the business. Then, and Clay Center sits, more or less about there, and the transmitters for KFRM are 27 miles west of there. We can't even get KFRM in Clay Center. You have to go 3 miles west of Clay Center, and then you can listen all the way out here to the Colorado border, or if you go 3 miles south, you can listen all the way to Oklahoma City, but we can't get it in Clay Center. So, and that is because of the physics of AM radio. Now, at this point, I've already passed what I know about the physics of AM radio, okay? But we are 550 AM, and I always say KFRM, 550 AM, there's nobody lower than KFRM. Well, with AM radio, the lower you are on the dial, the further you go. And perfectly honestly, Hutchinson and Wichita is very near the center of our broadcast area. And so if we aren't interested in traveling, I mean, it's our fault that we live clear up here on one edge of our broadcast area. And if we aren't interested in traveling, we couldn't do what we do. And partly the reason we chose this was I understood agriculture, and a lot of agricultural broadcasting had gotten so early in the morning that I never even woke up that early. And there was a huge paradigm shift about that time in agriculture. Agriculture is, I don't know if it's really that much different than other small businesses, and I purposely use the word small business. But the average age of the farmer in the United States is 57 today. I think when I started farming, it was somewhat in that neighborhood. It's inherently older. Now, again, maybe small businesses are the same. I don't know. But there's people that pop that number off, and in order to sell the concept that agriculture is in big trouble, it's dying, and that sort of thing. And I think it's been that way forever. It's a very capital-intensive industry. It takes a long time to build the capital necessary to be self-sufficient. And but one thing that is happening with all the new technologies, you can be much older and stay involved in agriculture. As long as you're willing to have the capital risk. And in 2008, we had our normal number of farmers that would retire every year, and corn went to $7 a bushel. Now, I know you don't follow farm markets, but today it's about $3. So it just changed the entire paradigm of agriculture out there, because farmers were literally making more money than they could have ever dreamed of making, and I mean dreamed of making their entire life. And I mean, I will extol that point just a bit when a man asked his wife, "In your wildest dreams, what would I do for you tonight?" And she said, "You are not in my wildest dreams." So the point is $7 corn was in nobody's wildest dreams, seriously. But what happened then was all the farmers were literally, at that point, they quit retiring. But the technology that was available to them was very, very expensive. And so what a lot of them started doing was hiring more work done. The infrastructure that's available in agriculture, literally you can be a farmer and not own any equipment. And really, you don't even have to know that much about farming, if you are willing to risk the money. And that's what's changed the last 3 or 4 years, because now, I told you corn is about $3 a bushel, now the profitability is much more back to historic levels. Levels to where most small businesses are. When you have a good year, you make a few percentage of sales, and you have a bad year, but most of the time you just make a living. So we're seeing a lot of people now considering getting out of farming, because we had a lot of people who didn't over the last decade because the profitability was so high. The reason I bring that up, and by the way, I'm going to probably open this to questions early, because there's so many directions we could go, and we found it at the table here, and I'd be glad to address any one of them. But if you look at that alone, for instance, I've heard realtors say, "Oh my gosh, the amount of farmland we have for sale right now is just a lot, and it's very staggering amounts." And people would extrapolate that agriculture is collapsing. Well, we didn't have those sales a few years ago, and literally land tripled in price. And now at this point, you had people that would have sold their land, but they went into a family trust because the profitability was so good. So you have a bit of a warped timeline because of economic factors. And I use that to morph into Kansas agriculture probably pays more attention to economic factors than any other agriculture in the world. The world. We are unique in here because Kansas farmers do not plant a crop expecting to harvest. Now, I know that sounds, whoa. But the thing is Kansas farmers, and I'm going to use this word on purpose, exploit what God has given as the resource that year. And that drives people crazy out here in agribusiness, because we can go up and down with the number of soybean acres by 1 million or 2 million acres a year. And it's like, what is that about? Who can figure? Well, it's because it rained right after wheat harvest, or it didn't rain when they were planting corn, or it didn't rain in the fall when they were going to plant wheat, so they couldn't plant wheat, so they planted more milo. So the Kansas farmers are constantly adjusting to what is handed them, and they're handed rainfall and they're handed prices. Okay, a lot of people may have heard about the huge increase in cotton acres in Kansas, and you're on kind of the northern edge of that expansion. Almost all the cotton acres are right down in here, and this year I think it's about 250,000 acres. Okay, that got to a low in 2008 because of why? Because corn went to $7 a bushel. And it just devastated the cotton industry. I mean, they were getting off to a great start. We had 4 gins about here and here and here and here. And the acres went clear down to 50,000 acres because of $7 corn. Now you might go, oh my gosh, that was the worst thing that ever happened to agriculture. Well, it is what it is. It is what it is. And they just adjust to whatever. Well, the cotton acres, so if you happen to have a cotton gin, it was the worst thing that could ever happen. On the other hand, if you were a corn farmer out in this area, I mean, it was like profits you could never, ever imagine in your entire life. Like as many profits in 3 years as the entire generation had made their entire life. I mean, it was just because your cost of production was pretty much the same. And you got to remember, though, the profit normally is like this. Okay, so, and the next year you give away almost that much. So, I mean, farming is very marginally profitable. But in those years, it was tremendous. And there was a lot of bidding up of the prices of land. Well, all right, I apologize for being so eclectic here in how we go. But KFRM covers 120,000 square miles, the northern half of Oklahoma, about 18 counties up here. We go out to the Colorado border. This part of the state we don't cover, and really just right over here against the Missouri border, we don't cover that. And it's just because that's what the FCC says we have to be. I mean, if I could do more, I would, because there are very profitable farmers up in this area that would love to have our programming. But it is what it is. There's an area right through here that you notice that's a different color. Isn't that odd? That's called the Flint Hills. A lot of people think that the low populated counties in the state of Kansas are here. Uh-oh, I needed to touch something, I guess, to keep it from going dark. Uh-oh. There we go. But actually, some of the least populated counties in the whole state are right in here. And in radio, our entire income comes from listeners and advertisers. We get listeners, we get advertisers. Well, we have this huge gap in here where there aren't very many listeners because there's nobody there. And so then we'd have to skip over this. So my point in bringing that up is this agriculture here is completely different than this agriculture here. And there's differences here too. But for instance, they get almost 50 inches of rain on an annual basis down in this area. And this area up here gets about 36, 38 inches of rain. But this area up here are glacial soils, and that's the only place in the state to have glacial soils, and glacial soils are the same as Iowa. Now, they'd hate it when I say that to them, but this is little Iowa up here. And if you want to get smacked around, just say that to them, but they hate because it's not as dependable with rainfall as Iowa is, but certainly the soils. And you can look at a county by county corn average yield here, and it's very similar to statewide averages of Iowa. Now, this area is completely different. They get more rainfall, but they're literally 10 days from a crop failure because their soils are very thin, and it has to rain regularly or they don't have a good crop. So this is different, but we, for the most part, talk about out in this area. Now, I talk about that versatility. First of all, I don't think very many people understand that 13% of the entire labor force in Kansas is involved in agriculture. Now, if you're in Wichita, spend most of your business career and your life in Wichita, you go, really? Well, no, it's not in Wichita. I don't know what it is in Wichita. But when you get out into this area, it's probably 70 or 80% of the people that are involved in ag. Because you have all the way from truckers to fuel companies to repair shops and all of that. Everything depends on agriculture out here. I'll take that opportunity to bring up the point that we have the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill was tried to be passed here in the last few weeks. They're hoping now to pass it in December. Well, the important thing about the Farm Bill is not necessarily about farmers. Farm Bill is like 1,300 pages. How can you talk that much about farming, 1,300 pages? Well, it's a rural development bill. I mean, it's all the way from rural internet to rural electricity to rural telephone to water systems, SNAP, that's food stamp type programs and that sort of thing. So it's a very, very complicated program, but the thing is the easiest way to distribute money to rural communities is to give it to farmers. And then the farmers distribute it on a market basis throughout the community. And it's a good, efficient way to do that. Now, will you read that in a book somewhere? Probably not. But it really is about rural development. Now, how come Washington, D.C. would even care about rural development? I mean, we're a democracy. We're a representative republic. It's like where the people are is what counts. And there aren't people out here, okay? I mean, let's face it, a fourth of the state lives right here, a fourth of the state lives right here, a fourth of the state lives right here, and all the rest of that's the last fourth. So why does Washington, D.C. even care about rural development? Because over the years, rural development has done a lot for urban business and urban people. Do you know 40% of the armed forces come from rural areas? 40%, and yet the population, the percent of the population is only about 12. And now some will say, you will hear people say, well, that's an indication of how bad the economy is in rural America, because the only good job they can find is going to armed forces. It's like, that's not true. Because people in rural areas are disproportionately patriotic. And they want to do that. Well, that has a value. How many industry and community leaders do they flaunt the fact that they were raised on a farm? You know, elected officials. And why would anyone care? Well, because there is a perception that you learn a work ethic. And you do learn a work ethic. And so there's real value to that training ground of young leaders. The highest export, the best export rural America has is its youth. Yeah, we've exported our youth forever. And that breaks a lot of people's hearts. And it's like, yeah, well, it is. Actually, Congressman Moran, and I said Congressman Moran on purpose, I know he's a senator, but he quoted this about 10 or 12 years ago when the $7 corn era, if you will. He said, I can tell things are better on the farm. It isn't the vehicle that the farmers are driving. Let's face it, that is an economic decision having to do with taxes and reliability. And he said it's whether they're inviting their next generation back to the farm to farm. And he said right now, rural agriculture is good. And for me, that was terribly profound. Is that, you know, do you want to invite your children into your business? You know, is all the different things that are concerned. I travel a lot for KFRM. We're a full-time farm talk radio station. There's a reason that almost no one else does that, is because it's really, really difficult to do. I mean, because you got to fill it with something interesting and provocative and informative for your listeners. And the guys listen for like 12 hours a day. Which is, you know, so it's like if you said it at 8 o'clock in the morning, you better not say it again the rest of that day, because it's like they already heard it once. So you got to fill it with something else. Well, the reality is the amount of information that farmers have with the internet and with cell phones and computers and all that, they have I can't provide them anything they can't get somewhere else. But I can provide it to them fast and easy with no effort on their part. And that's exactly what we have on the wall. No farmer should go in the house at night and have to go to the internet, magazines, newspapers, or television to get the information he needs to run a prosperous farm and be a productive person and be a productive parent. Okay, I bet you're surprised I said the parent thing at the end, right? Because again, in rural Kansas, in rural America, family and parenting is a major goal for almost everyone. And so part of our programming talks about, we run a program called Today's Father. And people go, really? How's that agriculture? I thought you were full-time farm talk. And it's like, we are full-time farm talk, because that's what our farmers are interested in. And so we vary a lot of things in that line. We, quite honestly, try to not take a political view. In full disclosure, 20 years ago, I was on the state Kansas Republican Committee. I mean, just to tell you where I am coming from. The reason that we try not to take a political view is because I do not want to tell these people what to think. Because that's the best way to keep them from tuning in to me, is I tell them what to think, because they're a very independent bunch. All I want them to do is get them to think. Just give them the information so they can come up with a decision that fits what they like. And quite honestly then, because they think, then they are better representatives of the industry, and they're better resources to elected officials. Because elected officials, I know we have some in the room, they know when just a party line or some ideology is being spouted to them, and that the person really hasn't thought through it. But what we want is people to think all the way through it, have a deep thought, and have something that is actually of value. Okay, let's talk about acres. There is 46 million acres of agricultural land in Kansas. 46 million acres. It's like, okay, what's that? Okay, to give you some idea, there's about 95 million acres of corn in the entire United States, so about half, and about 95 million acres of beans this year. And it usually varies about 3 million acres depending on what the market does. So Kansas has agricultural land equal to about all the corn, half the corn crop or half the bean crop in the entire nation. It's like, really? Okay, now wait a minute. Now, I said agricultural land, but there's about 23 million acres of cropland. Okay, wait a minute. What's the other? The other is grazing land, right? And part of the reason that we have that is, number one, we don't have big municipalities that are gobbling up farmland, and secondly, we have almost no federal land. We have a couple forts, and we have a little national forest, a national park out here, and a little one here. But we don't have much national land, federal land, and so therefore we have that for agriculture. But I'm going to point out something that's subtle that almost no one else will notice. If you travel over in the eastern part of the United States, especially east of the Mississippi River, it's the most boring place, in my opinion, to drive through. All you do is a tunnel of trees. I mean, now I know there's agricultural land, but you can't see it, all right? And it's like, well, what do they do with all these trees? Now, there's a lot of people that think I'm a tree hater, and Senator Moran will say, I'm from the part of the state, of course now he lives in Manhattan, but I'm from the part of the state where we have a personal relationship with our trees, okay? Well, and certainly out in this area it does, but there is a lot of the United States that is just wasteland. I mean, I'm talking specifically the eastern part, because they don't harvest those trees. It just grows up to trees, and if you'll look, there's not a fence around it. Now in Kansas, if you aren't farming it, there's a fence around it. I mean, you harvest that, and partly it's because the margins in Kansas are tight enough that you can't afford to let land go unexploited. Now, I'm using that word on purpose because a lot of people use the connotation of exploiting a resource as a very negative thing. But if it's a resource and you don't exploit it, it's not a resource. And I'll give you a story about that, okay? There was a young man came home from college, and they had this terribly poor farm, and his dad tried to raise corn on it, and the corn just did badly year after year after year. And he said, "Dad, why do we keep raising corn on this hill that raises really bad corn?" He says, "Because that's what we do, son. We raise corn here." And he said, "Well, could I do some soil samples and that sort of thing and see if there's anything else we do?" And he says, "Well, sure, as long as it doesn't cost me money, you can do that." And so he did, and he found out it was very, very high in iron ore. And so he opened an iron ore mine, and the family became very, very wealthy selling iron ore. Now, did the dad have the resource all of his life? Yes. but he didn't exploit it. The son had the resource and exploited the resource and actually harvested the resource. Well, the reason that's important to talk about when we talk about Kansas agriculture is Kansas farmers, in my opinion, are the best exploiters of whatever God has handed them that year of anywhere in the world. And the reason I use the world, think about Iowa and Illinois and even Nebraska. What do they raise? Corn. And soybeans. Corn and soybeans. That's all they raise. I mean, you can't find anything else there. Except, oh, by the way, Iowa, a third of all the hogs raised in the entire country are in Iowa. So they don't ship that corn out. Well, they do, it's pork. So they have exploited their resource of a good corn area, and they turned it into really a good hog area. And they exploited the resource. By the way, we are close. I think we're 10th in hog production in Kansas. Now, this is not a made-up number. We are 10th in the nation in hog production, but 150 producers in Kansas produce 99% of the hogs. So you say, I don't see any hogs anywhere. Well, number one, you could drive right by the buildings and wouldn't necessarily know, because they're very nice looking facilities and that sort of thing. But if you get out into this area and down the Panhandle, Oklahoma is a huge hog producer. But by the way, they have a moratorium on any new hog production. No new hog production in Oklahoma. Iowa, a third of the hogs raised in the nation are in Iowa. Hogs produce two things that most people know them for: stink and manure. Okay? Well, I will tell you, $7 corn raised the price of fertilizer tremendously. And manure is a great fertilizer, and hog manure is the best. It is the best. So we actually own hog buildings that we lease to an integrator. Okay, it's commercial property. It's no different than leasing a building downtown here. I mean, we just get a rent check every month. Except that one of the things, we have to take the manure and dispose of the manure. Now, when we built those buildings, we felt that way. But now we get the manure. I mean, because each one of those buildings is worth about $10,000 a year in fertilizer costs. And that's all profit. So we get to put that on our land. Isn't that interesting? Oh, we were handed a resource and we exploited it. And down in this area, okay, somebody's got to show me the sign. Somewhere there's a sign out here that says no chickens allowed. Because up here there's huge chicken numbers, and here there's huge chicken numbers, and here there's good-sized chicken numbers, and Iowa has huge chicken numbers. And Kansas, I looked it up, the numbers are so small, they don't even give you a number, they just run slashes through the state as no significant numbers. Now, I mean, it's like, where's the sign that says we can't have? Because Kansas is known as a very friendly animal agriculture state. What does it mean to be friendly to animal agriculture? What's that mean? Well, we have the laws in place to have a fair playing field that protects most all different people. How does that work? Kansas passed the manure retention and manure management laws 2 years before the Clean Water Act. We were way ahead of the curve on that. And much of the rest of the country is still trying to catch up with our laws. Now he's like, well, that's terrible for animal agriculture. I mean, we had more restrictive laws. No, it wasn't. Because everybody that was wanting to invest, they knew the rules. They knew what sort of things they had to do in order to get a permit. And now, we talked about Iowa having a third of the hogs. How easy do you think it is to get a new permit in Iowa? you've got to get rid of that manure. I said get rid of on purpose because for us it's a resource, but for them, that's the biggest thing that's bidding up the price of land in Iowa over the last 2 years. Hog producers needing to buy more land to have a place to go with their manure. Doesn't have anything to do with the price of corn, price of beans. It has to do with manure disposal. So, and I'm purposely trying to confuse you. Okay, because truly the industry is that convoluted and it has that many strange tentacles. There is no issue that doesn't affect agriculture. And if you can come up with one, tell me, because I bet I can show. Because is immigration a big deal to agriculture? Absolutely. Almost all of our produce and animal processing is done by immigrants, illegal or otherwise. But it's a huge issue. Do you know that price of hogs right now is very, very low? And there is a very strong reason for it. Most hogs in the United States now, before they are even bred, they have a place in a processing plant. They have a hook date. In other words, those hogs are to be delivered to a processing plant on this date weighing this amount. And they know that, all right? So before you can really expand in hog operations, you've got to find someone willing to process that hog about 8 months later. All right. So if you want, and there's people that wanted to expand. So there is a plant right here outside St. Joe called Triumph Foods that was put in about 10 years ago that was entirely funded by hog producers. They put up all the money for it, borrowed the money because they could see this trend coming. And the price of hogs really doesn't affect those fellas anymore because the price of pork at the grocery store does. Because their hogs are delivered, they're processed, and they sell the meat because they own the meat company. Now, okay, was that a big deal? Well, when they went to build this additional plant up here in South Dakota, they needed $23 million to build the plant. And they offered it first to all the stockholders of this plant, and they all bought it. They didn't have any additional stockholders, and they borrowed no money. All of these guys so believed in how good it was that they built that plant all for themselves. But here's the tough part. So everybody starts producing for the plant. It runs 2 shifts a day. 3rd shift is cleanup, except that they couldn't find enough people to work the 2nd shift. It takes 4,000 additional people to run the 2nd shift. And these guys had all bred up for it, were producing hogs for it, and they couldn't find enough people to start the 2nd shift. So all of a sudden, you've got tens of thousands of hogs a day with no place to go. So you don't think immigration is a big deal and it doesn't affect everyone? And that's a perfect example of how big a deal it is. Now, wheat. When we bought KFRM in 1996, and again, this is kind of the area right here, there were 17 million acres of wheat under that signal. 1996, 17 million acres of wheat. Today, there's about 10. What happened to them? In 20 years, where did the wheat acres go? Did that ground just all become grassland? No. It switched over to, well, a little bit cotton. But you got to understand, we're having to account for 7 million acres here, right? So it's like, that's a lot of acres where cotton, canola, corn, sorghum, alfalfa. Why did they switch to all those things and away from wheat? Because wheat wasn't profitable. Now, there's another very significant thing here. Okay, GMOs are the most terrible thing that happened in the whole world, and they'll poison us all and kill us all. And after 30 years of consuming GMO corn, you'll grow another horn in your forehead. Except, wait a minute, GMO corn's been around for 30 years, and I've yet to see anyone growing another horn. Seriously, at what point is this thing been proven enough that you go, that's just silly? After all this time, there's been not a single adverse effect from it. Well, what happened during that time was out in this area, there we go, wrong button. Out in this area was huge numbers of acres of wheat. And corn breeders they went to developing drought-proof corn. Now, did you need drought-proof corn in Iowa and Illinois? Well, not so much. I mean, they put a little bit of that genetics into that, but it wasn't as big a deal as out here. Now, why would they care? Because, by the way, this goes clear up into South Dakota. South Dakota is now the sixth largest or fifth largest corn-producing state in the United States. South Dakota? What about 20 years ago? Yeah, there wasn't any corn up there, there wasn't any beans up there. It all is because of genetic engineering. And then, oh, and by the way, then, when you spray, I told you where that other plant was out in South Dakota. They built that as far away from other hogs as they could possibly get. No, because that's where all the expansion in the hog industry is going. And why is it going there? Because they have all that corn. And all that happens in 20 years. Well, so the breeders, they developed drought-resistant corn. And so then you have a lot of those wheat acres that went to corn acres. And why corn instead of wheat? Because it was more profitable. Well, so how much did that technology bring to things? When I graduated from high school, the average yield of corn across the entire United States, pretty close to 100 bushels per acre. And it doesn't matter if you can visualize 100 bushel or not. Today, 171. 38 years later, 171, and it varies, of course, year to year, bushels per acre in basically one person's, not lifetime, but one person's career. Well, that was all because of the technology that's put in the corn. Well, the other thing was the droughtiness out here. And by the way, if you raise wheat in this area, it's all got to be shipped up there. So the basis, what they pay you here for wheat, isn't nearly as good as they'll pay you up here. Okay, that's called basis. Well, on corn, it's exactly the opposite. This is, your basis here is really, really good for corn. The market is saying, hey, I want your corn. I don't really want your wheat. And so over the years then, our acres went from wheat to corn. But there was one other thing. There was pushback from the world on GMO anything. And wheat is exported. And the wheat industry was very, very worried if they had GMO wheat that nobody in the world would buy our wheat. And so the wheat industry, as a unified voice, said, no GMO wheat. And so the wheat breeders, and there was a lot of companies, just shut it down. And so the average yield of wheat over the years, I told you, average yield of corn went up 76%, 71%. Average yield of wheat over that time went up 6%. Basically, the technology, because the industry basically said no, then it left the wheat industry behind. Now, there's some other things. It's easier to ship wheat technology around the world than it is to ship wheat around the world. But still, oh, by the way, about 2 years ago, what did the wheat industry vote to do? Go to GMO wheat. Because they decided that anybody that was pushing back on it really didn't count, and that's the Europeans. They don't count. We don't sell anything to Europe. I mean, they export against us. The people who care about wheat, who really is going to buy it, are people who are wanting good quality calories, and that is Southeast Asia for the most part. And why do we care about Southeast Asia? Because that's where the people are. And their income goes up all the time. And the first thing any population in the world does when their income goes up, they buy better quality food. And better quality means higher protein. And generally higher protein, it's just something in the psyche, is higher protein is, for the most part, animal protein. The world craves animal protein. Now, bring me to one last thing, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. There is now technology available that they can take the bone marrow from beef or pork or chicken, and they can grow that meat in a petri dish. And they are now in the process of industrializing that to where it would be grown in vats similar to what you do with beer, fermenting beer. Okay, and I've seen it and I've read, and it's if you didn't know, you probably wouldn't know. Okay, and I interviewed one of the guys in San Francisco, and he said, well, the reason we put so much money behind this and doing this is because we have been promoting veganism and vegetarianism for 35 years, and we have not increased any of the population as a percentage into our cause, because there's something inherent with people, with individuals, that they need and want animal protein. And so that is why they went to this. Now, I will tell you, it's a good product. There's a lot of us, meaning people that are like myself, that don't believe that it'll really ever compete. I mean, it'll just be a higher price. And more power to you. I mean, if that's what the consumer wants and you can provide it at a great price, you know, but by the way, the pushback on animal agriculture is, hey, can you really call it meat? Because agriculture has learned in the past, over the last 30 years, that, you know, almond milk. Well, nobody's figured out how to milk an almond. How can you call it almond milk? And there's been lawsuits about that, and agriculture has been winning on that. I mean, if it's really a good product, why not just call it almond juice? It's like, well, okay, so it's a marketing name. And they've won those cases, and so right now the only pushback for agriculture is you can't call this meat. You can call it something else, but you can't call it meat. And so that's how they're pushing back on that right now. There is, okay, cotton down in this area, and by the way, almost all the cotton gins are owned by farmers. And, are owned by farmers, and they have all added 25% to their production over the summer. A cotton farmer does not get paid until his cotton is ginned. So he can harvest it at the edge of the field, and he doesn't get paid till it runs through the gin, and a lot of that didn't get ginned until June of this year. And so they've added to the capacity on that. So I knew it'd be like eating or drinking out of a fire hose. There's 1,000 different directions I could go on it, but big thing, 250,000 people in Kansas get their livelihood due to agriculture. About 30% of everything produced in the United States for agriculture is exported. 50% of all the wheat is exported. So export is huge. And right now, with all the questions about, NAFTA, it isn't now called that anymore, and all the trade things had agriculture in a very tough situation. And I was very proud that agriculture tried to be brave through a time when they really needed to be courageous, and most of them were. And so I guess at that I'll open it up for questions.
All right, we are definitely short on the time for questions here, so we'll try to get those in as we can.
Just real quickly, there are a number of people in Kansas that are pushing the production of industrial hemp. Is that a profitable farming crop anywhere?
I really wish you hadn't asked that. Okay, I'm going to be as diplomatic as possible. I don't get it. I don't get it. So I mean, if you want to talk, because they're recording all this, okay? And so if you want to talk afterwards, but I don't get it. So, what else?
All right, who's next? Over here. Oh, here's Mike.
What about sunflowers? I see some sunflower fields.
Absolutely. Yeah, the only processor for sunflowers in the state is up here in Goodland. And the further you get from Goodland, the less the acres you get. It's extremely legitimate crop. Kansas is about third or fourth, depending on the year, in production of sunflowers. But the Dakotas are so far ahead of us. And the main reason that sunflowers, we don't see more of it, certainly we can raise them, but we have other crops that are more profitable. And so it hasn't really grown in acreage just because they're fragile, because of the wind, and we have birds and we have insects. But certainly they process them up here, and the closer you get to Goodland, Kansas, the more sunflowers you'll see. Yeah, right here?
Right over here.
Okay.
Thank you for visiting the Pachyderm Club. Are you well versed or know know, I'm sure you know something about aquaculture.
Yes.
And up in South Dakota, we have these long-looking, parallel ditches with fish eating corn and growing fish. Is that how's that industry going, and what's your prognosis?
Well, there's actually someone just down here southeast of town that's raising shrimp now, aquaculture. Fish protein. The world really wants it. There's a high demand for it, and it brings a very, very good price. But we have pretty long winters here, and so fish don't grow in cold water, so you have to move them inside. Certainly the folks out here at Garden City have raised tilapia with their ethanol plant for 30 years. So there's a good market for fish, and it's just, we don't, okay, one quick thing. We hear about the dairy industry growing a lot in the state. How come we would grow so much? Well, we now have the largest dairy dehydration plant in the world out here in Garden City. Why is it? Well, because we can raise milk. It's so far to people, so they're dehydrating it so we can afford the freight. But my point is we have all the infrastructure in Kansas to deal with dairy, to deal with cattle. And so that's why it's growing so fast. As we know, the feedlot right out here at Potwin sold about 6 months ago to a guy in Minnesota to just raise replacement heifers for dairy.
Yeah, you remember the Dust Bowl?
Oh, well, not that old. No, I'm not that
I saw pictures myself. They grew the hedgerows. It seems to me they're cutting out the hedgerows. Is there any reason to that? We don't have to worry about dust bowls anymore?
Yeah, I've already had the reputation of being a tree hater, all right? Because, trees, they suck moisture in a lot of different directions. And actually, southwest Kansas, until 2 or 3 years ago, was drier than the Dust Bowl era out in that area. And we saw the huge dust storms rolling in. No, we didn't. The farming practices are so different because of minimum till and no-till that, in my opinion, the hedgerows, if you will, that was Franklin Roosevelt's idea, that the reason that there's no rain out in this area is because we have no trees. If we had trees, we would bring rain. Seriously, that's what the whole idea of that was. If we plant trees, we'll get rain. Well, it didn't really work out. And so, point is, and truly, you can be from here to that wall against a hedgerow, and you will have reduced crop yields in that area in a dry year because it sucks the moisture out. And so that's why they disappear. Now, there'll be a lot of people argue with me, and that's great, argue all you like, but I farmed since 1972, and we have a lot of those hedgerows up in Clay County, and it doesn't take an agronomist to see there's nothing there. So that's why they're going out.
Yeah, one question. It seems like everything is right here. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Right here, sorry. Is subsidized except for beef cattle. Is that correct?
Everything is subsidized. If there's any subsidies on wheat and corn and soybeans, they are so minor, I don't remember seeing a check. That was all changed about 15 to 20 years ago. Now, there is a thing that just went through about 2 or 3 or 4 months ago because of all the negotiations with the tariffs and that sort of thing, that the president put, I think, $12 billion in trade distortion payments out short term, 6 months only. That's it. And they basically document. And the payment for corn was 1 penny a bushel. And the reason is because through all this negotiation, price of corn didn't go down. I'd never seen a program that was pretty well executed like that. Beans, on the other hand, $1.25, because as soon as we started having these issues, beans prices went down. So my point is, there is some subsidization right now, but it's very, very minor. Sugar does, and there might be something with rice, but sugar is the most subsidized crop in the world. Karen?
Microphone, hold on.
I have 2 questions for you. is, have these tariffs impacted our farmers and producers? And the second is how important is technology for the future of Kansas farmers?
Well, I mean, the price went down. So, okay, here's an unspoken thing that you won't read in normal consumer publications because it's so complicated. Okay, most aggressive farmers do not wait for harvest to sell their crop. Because until the time of harvest comes, when is traditionally the lowest price you're going to get for a crop? Right at harvest, okay? And so most, I'll say, aggressive, progressive, large farmers don't wait for harvest to sell their crop. They sell ahead of time. Well, up until the 1st of May, you could get $10 a bushel for soybeans delivered in the fall. Well, there was a very high percentage of farmers that did that. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to point right at somebody right now, and I'm sorry. But there are farmers that actually carried over last year's beans still, went through $10 beans, didn't sell them, and they didn't sell any of this fall. Now, is that guy in a precarious financial situation? Yes. All right? But it's his choice. All right? Why did he hold through $10 beans? Because he thought he could get 12. All right? That was his decision. He could do that. And so my point is the tariffs agriculture, U.S. agriculture has acquired and exploited the technology that's available from around the world more than any other country in the world, more than Europe, more than any other country in the world. And we are now capable of competing with anybody in the world if we were on a level playing field. But Japan, for instance, they have a 25% tariff on all our hogs going in there. Why would you do that? Well, because their farmers can't compete with our farmers on production of pork. So the point is most all of agriculture would really just like all tariffs around the world to go away. And that's where President Trump is coming from. It's like, now wait a minute, if you do that though, now you are truly on the free market, and you might be a hog producer that somewhere in the world they can produce it cheaper, and you could go broke. But most all of agriculture says, yeah, just give me a chance to compete. Give me a chance to compete. Now, I'm sorry, the technology, there's very little technology in the world that we are not allowed to use. The Europeans, this is the one that makes me literally want to cry. And I mean that seriously, literally want to cry. The Europeans have tainted Africa so badly on GMOs that those folks believe that they are better to have their children go hungry than to eat GMO corn. Now that's fine in Europe. They've got plenty of other things to eat, and it's not a question of whether I can feed my children or not. I mean, if you've got enough, see, all those social questions with food are all made with a full mouth. If you are hungry, you don't worry about social issues with food anymore. And for the most part, almost all agriculture, almost all technology is available to, and they will adopt it. The one, I'm sorry, we're running long, but really quickly, the one that surprised everybody how quickly it was adopted was self-guiding tractors. And people was like, that's just, you got to have somebody out there anyway. I'd just be a lazy man that develop, that would adopt that. In 3 years, they went from no tractors having it to 80% of all new tractors had that. Now, it's not that you don't need someone in the seat, but it's the technology, GPS and its guidance system. 80% today, I think it's probably of good-sized tractors, it's 100%, because it's inexpensive, and American agriculture will exploit the resource of technology better than anyone else in the world because government generally doesn't stop them from doing it.